Welcome to a quiet night of ghostly tales. As the world slows down, we'll drift through haunted places and restless spirits, carried softly by stories meant to guide you into sleep. Do you believe ghosts are echoes of the past, or something still watching us now? Let me know your thoughts, and together, let's step into the whispers of the unknown. My name is Jacob. For 7 years, I've worked as a park ranger, mostly in quiet reserves, tucked away in the northern woods. I've seen storms tear through canopies, found lost campers, and even had bears nose around my truck while I was half asleep. But nothing I'd ever experienced compared to the place I was sent to last spring, a park that, as far as I can tell, doesn't officially exist. It started with a transfer order that made no sense. My name on a printed letter signed by someone at the National Park Service, whose title didn't appear in any directory. The destination field simply said, Echo Valley Reserve. No coordinates, no map pin, just a note to report there within 3 days. I called the number listed at the bottom, but it only rang twice before a voice answered. Flat, formal, and final. Report to the trailhead north of mile marker 77. You'll be met there. Don't bring GPS. The voice hung up before I could ask a single question. The drive out took me through country that didn't seem to exist on any recent map. Roads narrowed into dirt tracks, and even the radio lost its signal halfway through the drive. I passed no signs, no trail markers, just miles of black pine and fog curling low to the ground. At one point, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, a figure keeping pace with my truck. But every time I turned my headlights toward it, there was nothing. When I finally reached what looked like an entrance, I almost missed it. A crooked wooden board leaned against a rusted gate, the paint long faded except for 3 words barely visible in moonlight. Welcome to Echo Valley. There was no emblem, no ranger crest, no visitor center. Just a dirt path leading into a forest that felt older than anything I'd ever seen. At the end of the trail sat a small ranger station. The lights were dim, and the air smelled like wet cedar and something faintly metallic. Inside, behind a desk cluttered with yellowed maps, sat an older man in a faded uniform. His badge read Marlin. He didn't greet me right away. He just looked up, studied me for a moment, and said quietly, "You made it." Most don't. I thought he was joking, so I smiled. He didn't. He slid a worn leather folder across the desk. Inside was a single sheet titled Ranger Conduct Rules. There were 10 of them, handwritten, in ink, and that had bled through the paper. Some sounded like standard safety guidelines, but others didn't. Rule 3, never use the radio after dusk. Rule 5, don't follow echoes. Rule 7, if you see lights between the trees, report to base immediately. And the last one, underlined twice. Rule 10, never mark a new trail. I looked up confused, but Marlin just said, "You'll understand soon enough. The forest here doesn't like being found." He handed me a small brass key for the cabin I'd be staying in, and pointed me down a path lit by a single oil lantern. As I walked, the forest around me was almost unnaturally quiet. No wind, no insects, just the crunch of my boots and the faint sound of water somewhere far off. Every few steps, I caught the scent of something sweet, like wild honey, and then it would vanish, replaced by the sharp tang of damp earth. The cabin itself was small but solid, wooden walls, a stove in the corner, a bunk bed, and a table with a radio set. On the table sat an old map of the area, though most of it was blank. Just an outline of the park border, and inside a handful of names scrawled in pencil. Mirror Creek, Hollow Point, Deadman's Lookout. None of these appeared on any official map I'd ever seen. As I unpacked my gear, I heard the forest shift. A faint crackle, like footsteps moving slowly around the cabin. When I stepped outside, the air was still again. My flashlight beam cut through mist, catching only trees, tall, black, and watching. I told myself it was just wildlife. It usually was. Still, I locked the door before turning in. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint at first, like someone speaking through fabric. Then clearer, a voice, low and deliberate, coming from just outside the window. It said my name. Not shouted, not called, whispered. Jacob. I sat up, listening hard. The voice came again, a little louder this time, as though whoever it was stood just beyond the porch. Jacob, come here. My chest tightened. I checked the clock. It was 12:37 a.m., well past dusk. Rule 3 echoed in my head. Never use the radio after dark. But the silence was unbearable. I grabbed the radio anyway, pressed the call button, and whispered, Marlon, someone's outside. The radio hissed softly. Then through the static his voice came. Don't open the door. I froze. You can hear it too? I whispered. There was a long pause, then, no, but if it knows your name, it's not a person. I stared at the door, heart pounding, as the voice outside spoke again. This time it didn't sound human. The tone was wrong, too smooth, too steady, like someone trying to remember how to talk. It repeated my name over and over, each time with a different inflection, sometimes pleading, sometimes amused. Then it tried something else. Jacob, it's Marlon. Open up. The imitation was almost perfect. Almost. The vowels were stretched too far, the rhythm slightly off, like hearing your reflection try to speak back at you. I backed away from the door, clutching the radio to my chest. When I looked through the window, I could see only the faint outline of trees swaying under the moonlight. No person, no animal, nothing at all. But when I turned off the flashlight, for just a moment, I thought I saw a shadow pressed against the window pane, shaped exactly like me. I stumbled back from the window, nearly knocking over the chair beside my bed. The shape outside didn't move, it only lingered, dark and still, like a smudge on the glass. I held my breath, half expecting it to vanish the moment I blinked. But it stayed solid and deliberate. Then slowly, it raised its hand. I could hear the faint squeal of skin against glass as it traced a line down the window. I fumbled for the lantern, turning up the flame just enough to see. The light spilled across the room, soft and golden. When it touched the window, the shadow melted away. Gone, as if it had never been there. Only a faint condensation mark remained, like a fingerprint that didn't belong to anyone living. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat awake for hours, staring at the walls, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it had been my own reflection. Maybe I was just overtired from the drive. But somewhere between the ticking of the old clock and the sighing of the wind, I realized something unsettling. The air outside had gone completely still again. No crickets, no owls, no rustle of trees, just silence, so deep it pressed against the cabin like a second skin. By dawn, the world had softened back into normal sounds. The creak of trees, the chatter of birds, the low groan of the forest waking up. I stepped outside, half expecting to find footprints in the dirt, but there were none. The earth around the cabin was untouched, except for one strange thing. A small, neat pile of pebbles stacked by the steps. 7 stones, each slightly larger than the one below it, forming a perfect tower. When I asked Marlon about it later that morning, he just stared at me for a long time, chewing the end of his pipe before answering. It means it saw you, he said. Saw me? He nodded. The forest likes to watch new arrivals. Don't worry too much. It usually just looks. I laughed, waiting for him to smile, but he didn't. He handed me a thermos of coffee and a paper map, yellowed and fragile, with trails drawn in thick black ink. Stick to these paths. If you find one that isn't on here, don't follow it. Report it. Got it? Sure, I said, still half asleep. He placed his hand on my shoulder. No, Jacob, I mean it. Don't follow it. The morning patrol took me along Mirror Creek, a thin ribbon of water cutting through birch trees and moss-covered stones. The sunlight filtered through in narrow columns, turning everything gold and green. It was peaceful, too peaceful. Every sound carried further than it should. Even the crunch of my boots seemed louder than normal. After an hour or so, I reached a clearing where a wooden sign had fallen over. I lifted it back into place. The letters carved into it were almost erased by time, but I could make out the name, Hollow Point Trail. That name wasn't on the map Marlin gave me. For a moment, curiosity tugged at me. The path looked like it hadn't been walked in years, covered in leaves and mist curling low over the roots. But I remembered his warning, the way his hand had tightened on my shoulder, and I turned back toward the main trail. The radio on my belt crackled once faintly. I froze. Static hissed for a few seconds, then a whisper came through, a voice I didn't recognize. Ranger 12, check your 6. I spun around, heart thudding, scanning the tree line. No one. The voice came again, clearer this time. Ranger 12, check your 6. That wasn't my call sign. I'd been assigned Ranger 2. I unclipped the radio, raising it to my mouth. This is Ranger 2. Who's calling? Silence. Then the sound of breathing, slow, heavy, and deliberate. Not through the speaker, but from behind me. I turned sharply, shining my flashlight into the trees. A shape darted between them. A tall, human silhouette, moving just out of view. I caught only fragments, a glimpse of a uniform sleeve, the reflection of a badge, and the faint impression of a face that looked familiar. Too familiar. I didn't chase it. Instead, I backed away until the station came into sight through the trees. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the forest behind me fell still again, as if nothing had moved at all. Inside, Marlin was sitting at the desk, flipping through an old logbook. Without looking up, he said, "You heard the radio, didn't you?" My stomach tightened. "Yeah. Someone called for Ranger 12. He finally met my eyes. There's no Ranger 12 here. I wanted to laugh, but the look on his face stopped me. He wasn't joking. He tapped the edge of the logbook, his voice low and flat. "If you hear that call again, don't answer. Those aren't our channels. Those are for the ones who never left." I asked him what he meant, but he closed the book and stood, brushing past me toward the door. "You'll understand soon enough. The forest remembers every name it's ever taken. Sometimes it calls them back." That night I marked the rule on a piece of paper and pinned it to the wall above my bed. Never follow echoes. Never answer the radio after dusk. And as I blew out the lantern, I could swear the wind outside whispered the same words back to me in a voice that wasn't mine. The following morning began with fog so thick it swallowed the tree line whole. The air tasted damp and metallic, and every sound seemed to echo twice before fading. I woke to find fresh dew on the windows and another small tower of stones on the porch, this time with a strip of red cloth tied around the top one. The fabric looked old, frayed at the edges, and for a strange moment, I thought I recognized it. The Park Service used to issue red signal flags years ago before radios became standard. I hadn't seen one since training. When I mentioned it to Marlin over breakfast, he didn't even look surprised. He poured his coffee, stirred it slowly, and said, "You didn't move them, did you?" I shook my head. "Good," he replied. "Never touch what the forest leaves behind. It's its way of marking where it's been." He leaned forward then, his expression serious. "And if it starts leaving them closer to your door, let me know. That means it's getting curious." His words settled in the back of my mind like a shadow that wouldn't go away. I tried to shake it off during patrol, but every turn in the path looked unfamiliar, as if the woods were subtly rearranging themselves. I followed the creek until the water ran shallow, and there, among the roots, I found something strange. Boot prints. Not mine and not Marlin's. They were smaller, lighter, almost delicate, like a child's. They led from the water's edge toward the deeper woods where mist hung in long silver threads. The prince stopped at the base of a pine tree, and beside it lay an old ranger's hat, the kind they stopped issuing decades ago. I crouched down and picked it up. The fabric was stiff, brittle with age, and inside faint letters had been written in ink. Property, a Ranger 12. I froze. The moment I touched it, a cold rush swept through the clearing. Not a breeze, but something heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then came a whisper, faint, distant, from behind me. Check your six. I dropped the hat and turned, scanning the trees. There was nothing there, only the mist, swirling as if something had just passed through it. I backed away, my pulse hammering, and forced myself to breathe. It was too easy to get turned around in fog like this. Too easy to lose the sense of direction. I needed to get back to the main trail. But as I retraced my steps, something felt wrong. The creek was gone. The trees around me looked different. Taller, maybe. Their trunks were smoother, as though carved or polished. And then I noticed it. The faint outlines of symbols etched into their bark. Circles within circles, broken lines, spirals that seemed to twist when I wasn't looking directly at them. When I finally broke through the fog, the forest opened into a clearing I didn't recognize. In the center stood an old fire tower, leaning slightly to one side. The metal steps were rusted, and half the structure was overtaken by ivy. I should have turned back. I knew I should have. But something about the tower drew me in, like an itch at the base of my skull. I climbed slowly, each step groaning under my weight. From the top, the view should have been clear, but the fog clung to everything, moving like water. I could see faint outlines of trees below and something else. Dozens of shapes scattered across the clearing, arranged in neat, unnatural lines. They weren't rocks. They were stones, piles of them, just like the ones outside my cabin. I counted at least 50. Then I saw movement below. A figure walking slowly through the mist. It was wearing a ranger uniform, same as mine. The posture was familiar, careful, measured. I leaned forward, trying to see the face. When the fog parted, my stomach dropped. It was me. Or something that looked like me. The figure paused, tilting its head up as though it could sense me watching. Even from that distance, I could tell its eyes were wrong. Too dark, too still. Then it smiled. A slow, deliberate stretch of lips that didn't reach the eyes. I stumbled back from the railing, heart racing. My hand brushed against the metal and came away wet, but not with dew. A dark, sticky smear clung to my fingers. Blood. Fresh. I looked down again, but the figure was gone. I climbed down as fast as I could, nearly slipping twice. When I reached the clearing, the fog had lifted, just enough for me to see that every stone pile was marked now with a strip of red cloth, fluttering gently even though there was no wind. My head swam with questions I didn't want answered. I ran until my lungs burned, until the trail finally led me back to the ranger station. Marlin was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, pipe unlit. He looked at me, took one glance at the blood on my hand, and sighed. "You went off map." I didn't argue, I just nodded. He motioned for me to sit and went inside. When he returned, he was holding a small tin of salve and a weathered notebook. He treated the scrape on my hand in silence, then opened the notebook to a page filled with lists of names. Some were crossed out, some weren't. He pointed to one halfway down the page. Ranger 12 Thomas Reeves. "That's him, isn't it?" I asked quietly. Marlin closed the book. "That was him?" Before the forest took his voice. I stared at him, not understanding. "The forest keeps what belongs to it," he said softly. "Voices, faces, sometimes whole people. That's why we have the rules. The ones who break them. They come back, but not as themselves." He didn't elaborate further, and I didn't have the courage to press him. That night, when I lay in bed, I could hear the sound of soft tapping on the porch steps, then the faint crackle of the radio turning on by itself. Through the static, a voice came, low and calm. My voice. Ranger 12. Check your 6. I froze, the radio slipping from my hands. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure the voice could hear it. Ranger 12. Thomas Reeves. Whoever or whatever he had become. My own voice echoed through the static, repeating the words as if mocking me. I didn't move. I couldn't. The tapping on the porch grew louder, deliberate. Each step matched the cadence of the voice, as though it were keeping time with my heartbeat. I gripped the radio, willing it to be just a malfunction, a trick of my mind. But then the voice changed slightly, softer now, almost coaxing. Jacob, come outside. I swallowed hard. My eyes darted to the door. The forest beyond was black, thick with mist curling around the trunks of the trees. Shadows moved where there shouldn't be any. I wanted to scream, to run, but something held me back, a strange magnetic pull. The air smelled sharp, wet, metallic. It reeked of something alive and something dead at the same time. I remembered Marlin's words. The forest keeps what belongs to it. Slowly I turned, trying to listen. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the cabin siding, the low rustle of branches. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Not the soft patter of an animal. Human, deliberate, pacing the perimeter. And I could feel the eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I grabbed the lantern and stepped outside, the beam cutting through the fog. My boots sank slightly in the wet dirt. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. And yet I could feel someone just beyond the lantern's glow, watching, mimicking, learning. Then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, uniform dark against the mist. It raised a hand. My chest tightened. The moment the lantern light touched it, I knew. The face was mine. I stumbled backward, tripping over loose stone. The figure didn't move. Not at all, just watched. And then slowly it began to step forward, each footfall silent, as if the earth itself swallowed the sound. My voice caught in my throat. I whispered, "Marlin, help." The forest seemed to respond to my fear. Trees shifted, their trunks bending slightly, shadows stretching unnaturally. Fog rolled in, thicker this time, swallowing the figure before I could get a full look. When it reemerged, it was closer, the imitation flawless down to the smallest detail, even my eyes mirrored perfectly, dark and hollow. I ran. My boots tore at roots and mud, my lungs burned, and every branch seemed to reach for me. Behind me, I heard the soft tapping again, footsteps keeping pace, echoing mine, never faster, never slower. The radio, still clutched in my hand, hissed with static, repeating the same words. "Check your 6. Check your 6. I crashed through a thicket and found myself back on the main trail, panting, soaked in sweat and mud. The fog thinned, and I dared to look behind me. Nothing, and only the forest, silent, as though it had never stirred. But I knew better. I could feel it. The forest was alive, watching, waiting. I made it back to the cabin, bolting the door behind me. Marlin was there, as if he had been waiting all along. "You've seen it," he said simply. No anger, no surprise, just understanding. "I saw myself," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It was me. My face, my voice. Everything." Marlin nodded slowly. "That's how it works here. The forest doesn't just copy you. It learns you. It waits. If it likes you enough, it keeps you. Some leave pieces behind, echoes, voices, gestures. Others don't leave at all." I sank into a chair, trying to calm the thundering in my chest. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying faint whispers, names, voices, some mine, some not. The tapping on the porch returned, soft, deliberate. The radio crackled. "Ranger 12? My stomach sank. I knew I had to follow the rules. Never follow echoes. Never answer after dusk. Never mark new trails. I repeated them in my head like a mantra, hoping it would keep me safe. Then I noticed something chilling. Another small tower of stones had appeared on the porch. 7 stones topped with a strip of red cloth, just like before. Only this time, the top stone was shaped like a tiny human figure. I understood finally. The forest wasn't just watching me, it was learning me, testing me. And if I failed, it wouldn't just call my name, it would become me. I spent the night awake, lantern in hand, watching shadows shift beyond the cabin walls. Every whisper, every step, every echo of my own voice was a warning. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. And when dawn finally came, pale and trembling through the mist, I realized that leaving the cabin didn't feel safe anymore. The forest had already marked me, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to see what it would do next. The forest is patient. It remembers every name, and it always waits for the curious to step off the trail. The morning after my first night in the cabin, the forest felt heavier than ever. Even in daylight, the trees seemed to lean closer, their trunks twisted and gnarled, branches brushing together in whispers I couldn't understand. The birds were quiet, the creek muted, and every step I took along the trail felt amplified, as if the forest itself was listening. I knew I had to patrol, but something inside me resisted. Every fiber of my body wanted to stay put, to barricade myself inside the cabin and ignore the world beyond the porch. Marlin appeared at the edge of the clearing, his silhouette framed by the rising sun. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He just nodded. I followed him silently as he led me down the main trail, pointing out markers, water sources, and hazards. Everything seemed ordinary until we reached a bend where the path split. He stopped and turned to me. "These are the rules," he said quietly, tapping the map with a gloved finger. "Some are written, some aren't. You will learn them quickly, one way or another." I looked at him, confused. "The written rules? The ones in the folder?" He shook his head. "Those keep you alive at first. The rest, well, the forest teaches them." He let the words hang there. I didn't press him, though curiosity burned inside me. I had to know. We walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of our boots on the leaf-strewn trail. Then he stopped again. A small deer stood at the edge of the path, completely still, eyes wide, ears pricked. I assumed it would run when I raised my lantern, but it didn't. It stared at me for a long moment, and I could swear its gaze was heavier than it should have been, almost human in its intensity. I shivered. Marlin noticed. "The forest remembers. Everything it sees, it keeps. Animals, people, movements. It doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Disobedience. Curiosity that leads you off trail. Responding to voices you shouldn't. Touching things you shouldn't." He pointed to a pile of moss-covered stones. "Even something as small as picking up a rock can leave a mark. And once the forest knows you, it will test you. It will call your name. It will imitate you. And sometimes, it will take what it wants." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my fear contained. I had to admit, though, a small, reckless part of me wanted to test it. Just a little. See if it was as real as he said. But the memory of the shadow outside my cabin that first night held me back. As we continued down the trail, I began noticing subtle oddities. Paths looped back in ways that didn't make sense. A tree that should have been 2 steps off the trail appeared directly in front of me, though I hadn't remembered it being there. And everywhere I looked, shadows seemed to linger, just beyond the edge of vision, moving in the corners of my eyes. Marlin stopped again at a fork in the trail. "Do you see that?" I followed his gaze. There was a thin line of fog curling through the trees, and within it, faint footprints. Not ours. They were small, deliberate, human-like. "Someone passed through here recently?" I asked. He shook his head. Not recently. Long ago, or maybe not yet. The forest plays with time. It shows you things that aren't there yet, or that have already passed. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. We walked past the fog, boots crunching softly on the damp leaves. Then I noticed a faint voice carried on the wind, low, almost hesitant, repeating my name. My pulse quickened. I remembered the rule, never respond. I didn't, but I couldn't stop my head from turning, scanning the trees. The voice came again, slightly closer, more confident this time. It mimicked the way I spoke, the tone I used when I was tired or nervous. Marlin glanced at me sharply. Do not turn your head. Do not respond. I froze, staring straight ahead, trying to keep my breathing even. The voice lingered for a few moments longer and then faded, swallowed by the forest. I exhaled, though my chest still ached. That's why the forest's rules are important, Marlin said quietly. Every sound you make, every step you take, every glance matters. The forest watches and learns. It will remember your patterns, your mistakes. And if it finds you, curious or careless, it will test you again, harder. I nodded, though the weight of his words pressed down on me like a stone. We reached a small clearing where a stream ran over mossy rocks. The sunlight caught the water, turning it into ribbons of gold. For a brief moment, the forest seemed peaceful, almost beautiful. I leaned down to fill my canteen, grateful for the distraction. Then I heard it, a faint splash upstream, too regular to be a fish. I froze, watching as a figure stepped from behind a tree. It wore a ranger uniform. My blood ran cold. I raised my eyes to the face. The shape tilted its head in that unnerving way I had seen before, its eyes, impossibly dark, fixed on me. I blinked. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone, leaving only ripples in the water. I glanced at Marlin, heart hammering, but he only nodded once as though confirming what I already knew. The forest had tested me, and I had passed. For now. Marlin led me back toward the station, speaking in low tones about water sources, hazard markers, and the subtle signs of forest activity. Every instruction felt heavy with meaning, as if each word contained layers I couldn't yet understand. The forest had rules, yes, but the rangers had their own. Ways to survive its tests, ways to leave without becoming part of its collection. Back at the cabin, I marked the new rules in my notebook, adding notes about the loops in the trails, the shadows, the voices, and the figures I had glimpsed. I wrote slowly, carefully, as if writing too fast might attract the wrong attention. By evening, the forest had grown darker than usual, and the air smelled damp and metallic once again. The wind carried whispers through the trees. I could hear movement around the cabin, not animals, not wind, but something that circled me, observing from the shadows. And then came a faint, deliberate tapping at the door, soft but measured. A small voice spoke through the crack, mimicking my own. Jacob. I didn't move. I remembered the rule. I didn't respond. I waited, heart pounding. The tapping stopped. The voice disappeared. The forest waited, patient and patient, until I understood. It was already teaching me the next rule. That night, sleep was impossible. The forest seemed to breathe around me, every shadow shifting as if alive. I sat by the cabin window, the lantern casting long, flickering shapes across the wooden walls. Every sound carried through the still night, crackling leaves, distant water trickling, branches brushing together. But there was something else, subtle and deliberate. Footsteps, not mine, not Marlin's. The soft, steady crunch of boots pacing in the darkness. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the radio. The static hummed softly, then burst with a whispering voice. Jacob. Jacob. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My pulse thundered in my ears. Each syllable was drawn out, almost melodic, echoing in a way that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The voice shifted, mimicking the way I had spoken to Marlin that morning. Every inflection, every hesitation, it was uncanny. I remembered Diane, the young ranger who had been sent here years ago. Marlin had mentioned her once, briefly, with a sad shake of his head. She had ignored the rules. She had answered. The forest had taken her. I wasn't going to make the same. The tapping returned, soft and rhythmic, like someone drumming on the door with measured patience. I held my breath, every muscle rigid. The lantern flickered violently, then stabilized. The shadow outside seemed to stretch, coiling and twisting in the dim light. I didn't move, I didn't blink. The forest, I realized, didn't just watch, it waited for signs of weakness. I stayed that way until the first hints of dawn, when the mist started curling around the treetops and the air lightened with the sun's arrival. I dared to peek through the window. The shadow was gone. The porch was empty. Even the small pile of stones I had begun to fear had vanished. For a moment, relief washed over me, though a part of me knew it was temporary. The next morning, Marlin called me to a clearing deeper in the park. "You need to understand the forest better," he said, his tone grave. "Not just the paths, the trails, the streams. The forest remembers every sound, every face, every movement. It records your presence in ways you can't even see. And if you forget the rules, it will remind you." We walked in silence for a while, following a narrow trail lined with moss-covered stones. He stopped at one particularly twisted tree. Its bark had deep grooves, and small symbols were carved into it. Circles, lines, and spirals that seemed to shift when I looked away. "These marks are old," Marlin explained. "They're warnings, left by those who came before. They tried to ignore the rules. Some disappeared. Some never returned." I traced the carvings with my finger, feeling the grooves. There was a chill that ran from my hand up my arm. I looked at Marlin. "Disappear how?" He didn't answer directly. "The forest collects. It keeps what belongs to it. Sometimes it's voices, sometimes faces, sometimes whole people. That's why you must never respond to echoes, never follow unmarked trails, never touch what the forest has left behind. It watches, it learns, and it tests you. Always." The next few hours, we patrolled the area near Hollow Point. Every few steps, I noticed small anomalies. A tree that wasn't there the day before. A cluster of rocks arranged in a deliberate pattern. A faint shimmer of movement in the fog. Each anomaly felt purposeful, as if the forest was communicating or warning me. At one point, I saw a trail that wasn't on the map, overgrown and barely noticeable. My curiosity flared despite every warning. I took a tentative step toward it. Marlin's voice stopped me. "Do not follow it," he said, firm but calm. "If you step onto unmarked ground, it knows you. And once it knows, it doesn't forget." I turned back, forcing myself to obey, heart pounding. I understood now. The forest's rules weren't suggestions. They were survival. Every action, every misstep could leave a trace that the forest would remember forever. Later, while marking the main trail, I noticed subtle signs of previous patrols. Small notches in trees, faint scratches, even patches of flattened grass. These were reminders, I realized, of those who had passed through, those who had survived, and those who hadn't. The forest was patient. It didn't hurry. It waited, learned, and adapted. By the time I returned to the cabin, the shadows had lengthened, and the wind carried a faint whisper through the trees. I could hear soft, indistinct voices mingling with the rustle of leaves. Names, perhaps, or echoes of past rangers who had failed to follow the rules. I lit the lantern and checked the radio. Silence. But I knew better than to believe in silence here. The forest was never quiet. As night fell again, the forest seemed to pulse with life, or something like it. Shapes moved just beyond the cabin wall, subtle and deliberate. The tapping returned on the porch. Soft, steady, patient. I didn't answer. I didn't move. The rules were clear, and I would follow them, no matter how terrifying it became. For now, that was all I could do. Learn, observe, survive, and never give the forest a reason to remember me in the wrong way. The next few nights tested me more than anything I had experienced so far. The forest seemed alive in ways I could not comprehend. Each step I took along the trails felt heavy, weighted with a presence that followed, shifted, and sometimes mirrored my movements. Even in the cabin, I could feel it just beyond the walls, the quiet, deliberate breathing of the trees, the faint scrape of roots against the earth, the almost imperceptible shift of shadows in corners. One evening, while I patrolled Mirror Creek, I noticed a faint shimmer in the fog. At first I thought it was the reflection of the moonlight on water, but as I approached, the shimmer grew, forming a shape. A figure stood among the trees, wearing a ranger uniform similar to mine. My blood ran cold. I froze, recognizing the familiar posture, the slow tilt of the head, the weight of the gaze. Its eyes, impossibly dark, focused on me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. The figure lifted a hand in a silent wave. My instincts screamed to run, but the rules Marlin had drilled into me held me in place. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I only watched as the figure slowly faded back into the fog, leaving the forest silent once more. My legs trembled and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing heart. When I returned to the cabin, Marlin was waiting outside, leaning against the porch railing. He didn't speak at first, just observed me with a calm intensity that made me feel small and exposed. Finally, he said, "You saw it." I nodded, voice barely audible. "Yes, it was me or someone like me. That's the forest's way of teaching," he said, his voice low. "It tests you by showing what it can take. The closer you follow the rules, the safer you are. The closer you stray, the more it will reach for you." I didn't argue. I had learned that much already, but the weight of it pressed down on me. A cold reminder that the forest was not simply a place of trees and trails. It was an entity, patient and patient, waiting for the unwary, learning them, and reshaping reality to suit its own memory. Over the following days, I began noticing more subtle phenomena. Trees shifted slightly when I looked away, as if adjusting themselves when unobserved. Paths looped in unnatural ways, twisting back to the same point despite my best efforts to follow a straight line. Deer, birds, even small animals behaved differently, pausing to watch me, moving in patterns that didn't feel natural. And sometimes, just at the edge of perception, I thought I saw shapes standing still among the mist, silent watchers in the distance. Marlin continued our patrols, teaching me the finer points of survival in this unmarked wilderness. "The rules are simple in writing, but complex in practice," he explained one afternoon. "Never follow voices, never mark new trails, never stray. But there are subtler rules, too. Observe patterns, respect boundaries. Always leave something behind when you move through the forest, so it remembers you came and not why. Take nothing without permission, and never underestimate its memory." He showed me a section of trail I had passed hundreds of times without noticing. Symbols were carved into the trees, lines, spirals, circles, each carrying meaning. "These were left by rangers who came before," he said. "Some didn't follow the rules. Some vanished. Some are still out there, in one form or another." I traced my fingers along the grooves, feeling a chill that ran from my hand to my shoulders. "Still out there?" I asked. Marlin didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the trees around us, then back at me. "The forest keeps what it takes. It may show itself to you now or years from now, but it never forgets. That is the ultimate rule." That night, the tapping returned on the cabin porch. My pulse quickened, but I stayed still, remembering the rule. Never respond, never engage, never approach. The tapping was accompanied by whispers, indistinct at first, then forming shapes from the words, names, voices of past rangers, voices that mimicked mine. One phrase repeated over and over, "Check your six." I didn't answer, I didn't move. I held my breath as the sound circled the cabin, moving around me, testing me. Time stretched, the minutes blurring into hours until finally the first rays of dawn filtered through the fog. Silence returned. The porch was empty. No stones, no footprints, no sign that anything had been there. By the next morning, I had begun marking my own notes of the forest's subtle rules. The placement of rocks, the loops of trails, the behavior of animals, the way fog gathered in patterns. I began to understand that survival here required not just obedience to the written rules, but constant vigilance, a careful observation of the forest's moods, rhythms, and warnings. Even when the sun was high, the forest's presence was palpable. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Sounds carried farther than natural. Shapes moved at the edge of perception, and sometimes, just sometimes, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the distance, always watching, always patient, always learning. And I knew deep down that the forest's lessons were only beginning. By the third night, I had begun to notice a rhythm to the forest, a subtle cadence that pulsed beneath every sound and movement. Even the way the fog curled through the trees seemed deliberate, as though it were drawing invisible lines, guiding attention or hiding it. Each night, the tapping on the cabin porch became more confident, more deliberate, as if the forest was learning the pace of my heartbeat and the rhythm of my breathing. It knew when I was tense, when I was curious, when I was afraid. That night, I decided to stay awake, seated by the window with the lantern casting a small circle of light across the cabin floor. Outside, shadows stretched longer than they should, coiling around the tree trunks. The mists moved like water, drifting closer to the cabin with a soundless grace. Then came a faint, scraping noise at the edge of the clearing. Not footsteps, not twigs snapping, but something soft, deliberate, like claws or nails raking across bark. A voice followed, careful, deliberate, imitating mine exactly. "Jacob," it whispered, drawing out the syllables as if tasting them. I didn't respond. I didn't even look. I knew the rule. And yet my muscles twitched, threatening to betray my resolve. Marlin's words echoed in my mind. The forest tests patience, obedience, awareness. It always learns. The voice persisted, changing subtly, mimicking tones of curiosity, fear, and irritation. I could hear echoes of my own voice, repeated in the cadence of my own past conversations. And then, just when I thought I could endure it no longer, the tapping stopped. Silence returned. The fog thinned slightly, and the night air felt lighter. I dared to breathe, careful not to make a sound. The following morning, Marlin led me to a section of trail I hadn't yet observed closely. The trees here were ancient, their trunks twisted and scarred with deep grooves. Symbols were carved into the bark, lines, spirals, concentric circles. "The forest communicates," he said softly, pointing to one particular set of spirals. "This means caution. Something or someone has passed through recently. The forest remembers every touch, every misstep." I traced the carvings with my fingers, shivering at the chill they sent up my arm. "Why show me these?" I asked. "Because the forest will not always be patient," Marlin replied. "It tests and teaches. Sometimes through whispers, sometimes through shadows, sometimes through echoes of those who came before. Obeying the rules is not enough. You must learn to read it, understand it, anticipate it." Over the next few hours, I practiced. I walked slowly, deliberately, studying footprints, animal trails, the direction of the wind, the way the fog moved. Every sound, every movement, every shadow had meaning. The forest was teaching me subtle rules beyond the written list. Don't linger too long in one place, never follow shapes in the mist, never pick up anything left behind. Observation and patience were as vital as obedience. By nightfall, the forest tests had grown bolder. A figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, wearing a ranger uniform identical to mine. It mimicked my posture, my gestures, even the way I held my lantern. I froze, heart pounding, remembering the forest's unspoken rule: never engage. The figure tilted its head, studied me for a long, unblinking moment, then slowly receded into the mist, leaving only ripples in the air and a lingering sense of being watched. I returned to the cabin, shaken, clutching the radio, but didn't speak, didn't answer the tapping that returned on the porch. I remembered Diane, Ranger 12, and the others Marlin had mentioned. They hadn't survived the forest lessons because they hadn't learned to wait, to observe, to anticipate. I vowed silently that I would not make the same mistake. That night the whispers came again, softer this time, echoing my own movements and even my thoughts. Names of past rangers mixed with my own, calling out, circling, testing my resolve. I stayed perfectly still, every nerve on edge, every sense alert. Hours passed like minutes, until finally, just as dawn's first light brushed the treetops, the sound ceased. Silence fell over the forest, heavy and watchful, as if it were acknowledging that I had endured the test. By morning, I began to understand the forest's true rules. Never follow echoes, never answer voices after dusk, never stray from marked paths, and always read the signs it leaves behind. But beyond that, the forest demanded vigilance, awareness, and respect. It would watch for every hesitation, every curious glance, every breach of patience, and it would remember. Marlin looked at me as I returned from patrol. His eyes were steady, calm, but I could see the weight of the park in his gaze. "You've learned much," he said quietly. "But the forest is patient. The rules are endless, and it will continue to teach. Always remember, it is not just trees and trails. It is alive. It listens, it waits, and it collects what it desires." I nodded, silent, understanding the depth of the warning. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying faint whispers of names I had never known and voices that sounded eerily like my own. The forest was patient, and I would need to be infinitely more patient if I hoped to survive. The forest's rules were no longer just words on paper. They were a living code, learned only through careful observation, obedience, and endurance. And as I prepared for the next patrol, I knew that every shadow, every whisper, and every echo was a test I could not ignore. The day began with a pale gray light filtering through the dense canopy of the forest. The mist lingered in low pockets along the trail, curling around roots and stones, and the air was damp with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. I adjusted my pack and checked my compass, noting the paths Marlin had carefully marked. Every turn, every intersection, every subtle deviation was recorded in my notebook. I had learned that the forest paid attention to the smallest details, and I could no longer afford mistakes. Marlin led me toward a section of the park that was notorious among the older rangers, the Lost Trail. It wasn't on any map, not the official one, not the faded hand-drawn ones Marlin kept for training. The trail was rumored to appear and disappear, to shift depending on who walked it, and to hold echoes of people who had vanished within the park decades ago. As we approached the beginning of the Lost Trail, Marlin stopped and pointed to a faint set of tracks, partially covered by moss. "This is where it begins," he said. "Notice the markers. They're subtle. Watch carefully. Never follow what the forest offers too freely. The Lost Trail tests your understanding of the rules more than any other place in this park." I studied the area. Sunlight barely touched the ground here, filtered through layers of leaves high above. The trail ahead was almost invisible, a narrow depression, winding between ancient trees. Roots twisted across it like fingers. Rocks were scattered unevenly, and the air itself seemed heavier. I could hear faint sounds, rustling leaves, distant water, and a subtle low murmur that I couldn't immediately identified. Marlin spoke quietly. Once you step onto this trail, you're leaving the main paths. Everything you've learned about the forest patience will be tested. The Lost Trail shows you what curiosity can cost. It will lure you with movement, with shadows, with voices. It will reflect your own image back at you in ways you might not understand. And it always waits. I swallowed hard. Part of me wanted to turn back, to stay on the main trail where everything seemed safe, predictable. But another part of me, the part that had survived the first few nights by obeying the rules and paying attention, knew I needed to see it. To understand the forest completely, I had to confront the Lost Trail. We stepped carefully onto the path. The air grew colder, heavier, and every step felt like it echoed for miles. The forest around us seemed to lean closer, watching, adjusting itself to our movements. Shapes shifted in the corners of my eyes, long shadows that didn't belong to any tree, flickers of motion just beyond sight. I forced myself to focus on the trail itself, my notebook, my compass, and the subtle markers Marlin had pointed out. After a few minutes, I noticed the first anomaly. A small figure crouched between two trees. I stopped dead, heart hammering. My first instinct was to move closer, to see, but Marlin's hand on my shoulder held me back. The figure was perfectly still, head lowered, almost blending with the shadows. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized its posture mirrored my own the moment I had first stepped onto the trail. "Do not approach it," Marlin whispered. "It's not what it seems. The forest will show you shapes that mimic life. It tests patience, obedience, and perception. It wants to see if you can distinguish reality from reflection." We walked past it carefully. As we moved, the figure didn't change, didn't react. It simply remained there, a quiet sentinel, a mirror of what I had been moments before. My stomach twisted, and I realized that every step I took was being recorded, judged, memorized. Further along, the path narrowed and the fog thickened. The sound of running water grew louder, but it wasn't a stream I had seen before. A low, rhythmic tapping echoed among the trees. It wasn't coming from the ground. It felt as if it were moving through the air, circling us. My pulse quickened. I remembered the rules. Never answer, never follow, never interact. Marlin nodded toward a fork in the path. One trail veered slightly upward, the roots tangled and slick with moss. The other twisted downward into a shadowed hollow. "The forest will offer choices," he said quietly. "Some are safe, some are traps. Learn to read the signs. Always observe before moving. Never follow what tempts you without verification." I studied the ground, the placement of stones, the way the fog gathered in one branch of the fork and dispersed in another. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but I began to see the patterns Marlin had been teaching me. The forest communicated through these small cues, revealing danger without speaking. We chose the path leading upward, careful and deliberate. The fog thickened as we climbed, and the trees seemed to grow taller, closer together, the air becoming almost suffocating. Shapes moved in the mist. I thought I saw fleeting faces peering from behind the trunks, eyes that reflected mine perfectly, mouths curled into faint, knowing smiles. I blinked. They vanished. The forest tested me with every step. Footprints appeared alongside ours, small, delicate, impossibly precise. They led both ahead and behind simultaneously, as if the forest were folding space. I forced myself to focus on the trail markers, the grooves Marlin had taught me to read, and the soft patterns in the mist that indicated which paths were dangerous. At one point, a small pile of stones appeared in the middle of the path, 7, perfectly stacked, with a strip of red cloth tied to the top. My breath caught. The forest was marking this trail just as it had marked the cabin. It was acknowledging our passage, warning us, testing me. Marlin leaned close. "Do not touch them. Do not move them. Observe only. The forest remembers, and it will keep record of your actions." I nodded, keeping my hands to myself. My mind raced. The lost trail was alive, not in the conventional sense, but in a way that defied all logic. Every sound, every shadow, every subtle anomaly was a test of obedience and awareness. It wasn't merely a path through the trees. It was a sentient entity, shaping reality around me, teaching, judging, and observing. We continued upward, fog swirling thick around our boots, the low murmurs increasing subtly, the forest's presence pressing closer with each step. My senses were stretched to the limit, every nerve alert. I understood that this trail did not forgive mistakes. One misstep, one glance at a reflection in the mist, one response to a whisper could change everything. The forest's rules were no longer abstract. They were survival, and the lost trail was the ultimate classroom. The higher we climbed, the narrower the trail became, forcing us to move single file. The mist clung to my jacket, dripping cold moisture down my neck, and every step seemed to echo unnaturally, bouncing off invisible walls in the fog. The forest around us shifted subtly, trees leaning closer, branches curling as though to block the way or to watch more closely. I kept my gaze on the trail markers Marlin had taught me to follow, careful not to glance at the shadows that flickered just beyond sight. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate voice, barely louder than a whisper. "Jacob." I froze, muscles tense, heart hammering. The voice mimicked the cadence of my own speech, the way I spoke when cautious, hesitant, uncertain. I remembered the rules immediately. Never respond, never approach, never follow. I kept my eyes on the trail, taking careful, measured steps forward. The voice persisted, rising slightly, pulling at the edges of my resolve. Marlin's hand tightened briefly on my shoulder. "Do not answer it. Do not even acknowledge it. It is testing you." We walked on, but the forest seemed to respond to the tension. The fog thickened, swirling around the roots and trunks, forming shapes that resembled human figures. Some mimicked our movements exactly, others mirrored me alone, tilting heads, shifting shoulders, breathing as if alive. My pulse raced. It was impossible to tell which shapes were real, which were echoes, and which were figments conjured by the forest itself. We reached a point where the trail split again. One path curved sharply downhill into a hollow where the fog pooled like stagnant water. The other trailed upward along a ridge, trees arching overhead, creating a dark corridor of shadow. I glanced at Marlin. He studied the signs carefully, tracing the subtle grooves in the bark and the placement of rocks. Then he nodded toward the ridge path. "The forest is testing perception now," he said quietly. "It will show temptation, distraction, even fear. The safe path is rarely obvious. Follow the markers. Trust the patterns, not the shapes or the voices." As we ascended, a faint shimmer appeared in the fog ahead. At first I thought it was sunlight reflecting off a wet leaf, but the shape slowly became humanoid. A figure in a ranger uniform stood perfectly still, half hidden in the mist. My stomach twisted. His posture was identical to mine, the tilt of its head, the alignment of its hands, the way it held its weight. I swallowed hard, resisting the instinct to step closer. Marlin's whisper cut through my thoughts. "It is not what it seems. Keep moving." I obeyed, careful not to glance at it directly. Every step was deliberate, measured, careful not to create any sudden movements that the forest could interpret as curiosity or weakness. Behind me, I felt a subtle presence following, moving in perfect sync with my own pace. The forest had learned the rhythm of my steps, and it was using it to test patience, obedience, and attention. Further along, the fog thickened, and the trail became almost invisible. I noticed faint footprints alongside small and delicate, too light to be real, yet precise enough to suggest intention. They weaved in and out of the main path, sometimes behind, sometimes ahead, as if the forest was demonstrating possible choices, luring the unwary off the safe trail. A small pile of stones appeared at the edge of the path. 7 stones stacked carefully, topped with a strip of red cloth, fluttering slightly despite the still air. I froze. My hands hovered over the stones, knowing the rules. Never touch, never move. I studied them carefully, realizing they were markers of passage. Warnings left by the forest to indicate observation, testing, and patience. Marlin observed me quietly. Every detail matters. The lost trail records every movement. It watches for hesitation, curiosity, and doubt. These markers are reminders that the forest is patient, but it also remembers, obey, and you may pass. Fail, and it will keep you. I nodded, swallowing my fear. The forest had become a living entity in my mind, a presence that responded to the slightest deviation from the rules. Shadows shifted. Fog curled in patterns I was just beginning to recognize, and subtle whispers echoed through the trees. Names, voices, echoes of rangers long gone, blended with my own thoughts. We continued upward, each step deliberate, alert, and careful. The trail seemed to bend and stretch unnaturally, yet the markers guided us, almost imperceptibly. I realized that surviving the lost trail was not just about following the rules. It was about understanding the forest, anticipating its tests, and respecting the boundaries it set. Every sound, every shadow, every pattern was a lesson. And the forest was a teacher that never tired, never forgot, and always waited for those who were willing or foolish enough to test it. The higher we climbed, the heavier the air became. Mist thickened around us, clinging to our clothes, seeping into my boots and chilling my skin. The forest had a rhythm now, subtle and relentless. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every distant drip of water seemed purposeful, as if the woods themselves were observing my heartbeat, measuring my patience, gauging my resolve. Then I noticed the shadows. At first they were small, flickering at the edge of my vision, but as we progressed they became more deliberate, more defined. Shapes of figures, some humanoid, some twisted, mimicked our movements exactly. Every time I blinked or turned my head, the shapes would adjust, appearing in new positions, always keeping pace with me. My pulse quickened. I remembered Marlin's warnings. The forest doesn't just watch, it learns, it imitates, and it tests. The trail narrowed further, forcing single-file movement. The mist pooled around tree roots, forming shallow, water-like depressions that reflected shadows incorrectly. I had to focus entirely on the markers Marlin had taught me to notice. Subtle notches on bark, faint scratches on stones, the curve of moss along the ground. The forest was communicating, but only if I was attentive enough to read it. A faint whisper reached my ears, carried on the mist like a ribbon of sound. My name drawn out slowly, carefully, mimicking the way I had spoken earlier that day. Jacob. I froze. Every fiber in me screamed to run, to answer, to turn, but I did none of those things. I remembered Diane, Ranger 12, and the other rangers Marlin had mentioned. They hadn't survived because they had failed to respect the forest's patience, had responded to its calls, had followed the unmarked paths of curiosity. I kept my eyes fixed on the trail, moving only when necessary, measured and deliberate. Marlin's voice came softly beside me. It will show you temptations, shadows, shapes, voices. Don't follow them. Don't respond. And never let hesitation guide your feet. Further along, I saw a flicker in the mist, a figure crouched between two trees. At first, I thought it was another ranger, another lost soul. But as I squinted, I realized its posture mirrored my own at that moment, down to the tilt of the head and the slight shift of weight from one foot to another. The forest had created a reflection of me, a test of patience, a challenge to my resolve. We passed the figure without a word. Its stillness was unnerving, but I focused on the path and the subtle cues left by Marlin. Moss lines, tree notches, stone placement. The forest had rules, yes, but it also had a language of its own. Obeying the rules was not enough. I had to understand them, read them, anticipate the tests it set before me. As the trail curved upward toward a ridge, I saw something even more unsettling. Footprints appeared alongside ours, small, delicate, impossibly precise. They weaved in and out of the path, some ahead, some behind, as if the forest were demonstrating options, teasing me with possibilities. Every step I took was mirrored, echoed, recorded. The forest was not simply watching, it was documenting, judging, preparing the next test. Then a new anomaly appeared. A small pile of stones in the middle of the trail, 7 stacked carefully, topped with a strip of red cloth, fluttering in the cold, still air. I froze. My hands hovered over them, remembering the rules. Do not touch. Observe only. Every detail mattered. The forest used these markers to communicate, to test, to remind me that it never forgot. Marlin's whisper broke the silence. It wants to see how you respond. It wants to know if you obey. Do not touch. Do not move. Observe. Learn. I nodded, muscles tense, eyes scanning the shifting mist. The forest had become an entity in my mind, alive in a way that defied logic. Every sound, every shadow, every reflection in the fog was purposeful, and the lost trail was a masterclass in observation, patience, and obedience. We continued, the ridge rising sharply. Fog thickened around our boots, curling like living fingers. Shapes moved in the mist. Shadows lengthened unnaturally. Whispers grew faintly audible, calling out names of rangers I had never known, voices twisted to mimic mine. The forest was patient. It was deliberate. And it was teaching me, step by step, that survival depended on far more than simple obedience. I realized then that the lost trail was not a place to conquer. It was a place to endure, to learn, to listen. And if I failed to respect its lessons, the forest would not hesitate to collect what it deemed its own. The deeper we ventured, the more the lost trail revealed its true nature. The trees became impossibly dense, their trunks twisted into grotesque shapes, branches intertwining overhead to create a near impenetrable canopy. The fog pressed down heavier now, damp and clinging, curling around our legs like living tendrils. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, even the subtle shift of my own breath, seemed amplified, magnified, as if the forest itself was listening and cataloging each movement. Then the whispers began again. At first, indistinct, carried on the mist. Names, voices, soft, deliberate, twisting into the rhythm of my own thoughts. I froze, heart pounding. The voice repeated my name, mimicking the way I had spoken when nervous or uncertain. Every syllable was drawn out with meticulous care. I forced my gaze back to the trail, remembering Marlin's warnings. Never respond, never follow, never engage. We moved slowly, deliberately. The trail seemed to stretch unnaturally, curving and folding back on itself in impossible ways. I caught glimpses of figures among the trees, human-like, indistinct. Sometimes wearing the uniforms of rangers I had never met. Some mirrored my movements exactly, others were static, their heads tilted as if observing, studying, judging. The forest was testing me constantly, assessing my patience, my attention, my obedience. At one point, I saw a faint shimmer through the fog. I froze, recognizing the form immediately. A figure crouched beside a twisted tree. It mirrored my posture perfectly. My stomach twisted. I remembered Diane and the other rangers Marlin had mentioned. They had failed these tests, some taken entirely, some lingering as echoes in the trees. I held my ground, my breathing slow, my eyes fixed ahead. Marlin's voice came softly, cutting through the mist. It wants to see your reaction. Observe, learn. Do not move. Do not respond. I obeyed, muscles tense. The figure remained, watching, an uncanny reflection of my own movements. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes felt like hours. The fog thickened, swirling around us, forming shapes that disappeared when directly observed, only to reappear at the corner of the eye. Every step I took was mirrored, cataloged, and recorded. The forest was patient, but it never forgot. The trail narrowed further, winding along a ridge so steep and the mist obscured the drop-off completely. Footprints appeared alongside ours, delicate, precise, impossibly measured. Some led ahead, others behind, creating an endless loop that could easily confuse an unwary traveler. I realized that the lost trail did not merely test obedience, it tested perception, awareness, the ability to read the forest's subtle cues and distinguish reality from illusion. We passed another pile of stones, 7 carefully stacked, topped with a strip of red cloth. I froze again. Do not touch. Observe only. The forest marked our passage deliberately, leaving reminders of presence, tests of patience and discipline. I studied the stones, aware that a single misstep could be noted, remembered, perhaps even punished. Further along, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The fog shifted, forming shapes that almost resembled people, figures frozen mid-step, faces twisted in expressions that mirrored my own fears and doubts. Every glance, every twitch of attention seemed to draw the shapes closer, testing my ability to remain focused and disciplined. I walked carefully, measuring each step, counting each movement, ensuring nothing betrayed my attention to these illusions. The forest language became clearer in those hours. It spoke in patterns, the alignment of roots, the placement of stones, the shifting fog, the subtle curves of the trail. Obedience alone was not enough. I had to interpret, to anticipate, to move in harmony with the forest's own rhythm. Every time I paused, the whispers circled me. Every time I glanced sideways, shadows shifted. Every hesitation was noted. By the time we reached the ridge's peak, exhaustion pressed heavily against my body. My boots were soaked, my jacket clung to my back, and my hands ached from gripping my gear so tightly. Yet the forest seemed almost approving. The mist thinned slightly, revealing the clearing ahead, a flat expanse surrounded by towering ancient trees, twisted and gnarled like silent sentinels. Marlin stopped, his eyes scanning the mist. "You have done well," he said quietly. "The lost trail does not forgive ignorance or disobedience. It tests every step, every glance, every heartbeat. You survived because you learned to observe, to respect, to anticipate. But remember, survival here is temporary. The forest never tires, and it never forgets." I sank to a nearby log, catching my breath, feeling the full weight of the experience. The whispers had faded for now, but I knew they were waiting, lingering, ready to test me again at the first misstep. Every shadow, every reflection in the fog, every anomaly along the trail was a lesson and a warning. The lost trail had shown me that the forest was alive in ways I could barely comprehend. It was not merely a collection of trees, fog, and stones. It was a sentient presence, patient, observant, and endlessly testing those who dared to walk its paths. It recorded every misstep, every hesitation, every curious glance. It mirrored and reflected. It whispered and waited. And it demanded obedience, awareness, and respect at every turn. As I looked out over the clearing, I realized that the lost trail was not a place one conquered. It was a place one endured, a place that demanded constant vigilance, unwavering attention, and complete understanding of the rules, both written and unspoken. And I understood, with a chill running down my spine, that the forest's tests had only just begun. The morning after traversing the lost trail, the forest felt different. Lighter in the sun, yes, but beneath that brightness there was an undercurrent I couldn't shake, a lingering awareness. as though the trees themselves had shifted overnight, observing more keenly than before. The mist that usually hovered low now appeared only in scattered pockets, yet when I looked closer, it moved with a deliberate, almost sentient motion. Marlin was quiet as we walked the main trail back toward the cabin. I knew better than to ask questions. Every word here carried weight, and the forest seemed to listen to conversations as carefully as footsteps. Even silence was not neutral. The lost trail had taught me that. Every sound, every shift in position, every glance could be a message, a test, or a trap. As we approached a hollow near an ancient oak, I noticed something unsettling. Small depressions in the soil, faintly outlined in the morning light, formed what looked like footprints, but they were too precise, too deliberate, and they curved unnaturally. They didn't belong to any animal I knew, nor did they match human gait. I bent down, brushing the soil lightly with my hand, feeling the subtle grooves. The patterns repeated, almost as if the forest were leaving a trail of its own design, inviting observation but warning against interaction. Marlin followed my gaze. "Those are echoes," he said softly. "Traces of people who never left. The forest doesn't simply take them. It remembers them, preserves them. Sometimes in glimpses, sometimes in voices, sometimes in shadows that linger just beyond sight." I swallowed hard, staring at the faint footprints. The concept of echoes had been abstract in my mind until now. These weren't ghosts in the traditional sense, but neither were they fully gone. They were residual impressions, imprints left by the forest itself, replaying moments and movements of those who had vanished. Some of these echoes were subtle, footsteps, rustling leaves, but others were far more vivid. We continued along the trail, and I began to notice more signs, small piles of stones appearing in odd places, twisted branches forming shapes, almost resembling human limbs, patches of fog that seemed to gather around certain clearings. My mind raced, piecing together the lessons from the lost trail. The forest didn't just test you through danger. It tested you by replaying fragments of lives, by mimicking, by tempting the curious to stray or respond. Marlin led me to a clearing I had never seen before. The ground was littered with subtle marks, depressions, scratches, and impressions of small objects, almost imperceptible, but arranged in deliberate patterns. I realized with a chill that these were not random. They were echoes of rangers and hikers who had wandered off the safe paths over the years. The forest preserved their movements, their mistakes, their final moments in a silent, patient record. Then I heard it, a soft whisper carried on the wind. My name drawn out slowly, carefully, in a voice that was familiar and yet impossible to place. It was a mixture of tones layered over itself, shifting as though several voices spoke in unison. My pulse quickened, and my hands tightened around my notebook. I remembered the rules: never respond, never approach, never follow. Marlin watched me closely. "Those are echoes," he said quietly. "They are not here in the way we understand presence. They are remnants, memories, moments folded into the forest. Some are harmless, some are dangerous. The forest uses them to test patience, observation, and obedience, and it will remember your reaction to each one." A movement caught my eye. Just beyond a fallen tree, a figure crouched, partially hidden by mist. It was human-like, but distorted, elongated, a flicker of motion that mirrored my own posture as I crouched to examine the ground. My stomach twisted. I stayed still, forcing my gaze to remain fixed ahead, refusing to acknowledge it directly. The figure mirrored my every minor movement, every tilt of my head, every adjustment of my backpack. Marlin whispered again. "Observe, learn. It will vanish when you do not give it attention. The forest preserves these echoes for study, not for engagement. They are the remnants of those who failed to respect the rules, who answered, who followed, who strayed. I felt the weight of the forest around me, pressing in from every side. Shapes flickered at the edges of my vision, branches swayed though no wind moved them, and whispers rose in soft layers, forming names I did not recognize but somehow felt familiar. The echoes were everywhere, imprinted on the soil, the fog, the trees. The forest was alive with memory, and it demanded I acknowledge my place within it, without faltering. We moved carefully, deliberately, following the trail markers, ignoring the fleeting figures, the whispered names of invisible footsteps. My senses strained. Every footstep, every glance, every breath had to be measured. Observation was no longer passive. It was survival. The forest remembered every hesitation, every moment of curiosity, every lapse in attention. And the echoes of the missing were the ultimate test. The sun dipped lower, filtering through the canopy, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. Even as daylight brightened the clearing, the echoes persisted. Shapes shifted in the corners of my vision, names whispered on the wind. Footsteps fell just beyond hearing rain. The forest was patient, methodical, and entirely indifferent to fear. Survival here depended not on courage alone, but on complete understanding and unwavering obedience. I realized, with a chill creeping along my spine, that the echoes were not static. They adapted, replayed themselves differently depending on my actions, changing with the forest's memory of me. A movement, a glance, even a subtle sound could alter the echo, drawing attention, testing resolve. The lost trail had prepared me to follow the rules, but the forest now demanded mastery, anticipation, awareness, and the ability to navigate the living memory it held. The clearing stretched ahead, silent yet charged, a repository of countless imprints of the lost. I knew this was only the beginning. The echoes would grow more insistent at night. Shadows would stretch and twist. Whispers would weave around the paths. Every misstep, hesitation, or act of curiosity would be noted. The forest would remember. And I understood, with a growing sense of dread and awe, that in order to survive here, I had to become as patient, observant, and enduring as the forest itself. We pressed on through the clearing, every step deliberate, every sense alert. The mist had lifted slightly, but the forest's presence was more pronounced than ever. Shapes lingered at the edge of my vision, fleeting glimpses of human forms, sometimes standing, sometimes crouched, always still. Their faces were indistinct, yet familiar enough to make my stomach tighten. I could feel their attention, the weight of unseen eyes tracking each movement, judging each choice I made. Marlin moved ahead silently, guiding me along the faint trail markers, pointing subtly with his hand to the grooves in the trees and the alignment of roots that formed patterns only visible to the careful observer. "The echoes will try to draw your attention," he said in a low bass. "They will mimic. They will tempt. They will replay moments meant to confuse you. Ignore them. They exist to teach, to test, and to observe. Do not engage, or you risk becoming part of the forest memory." A sound caught my attention, a soft, hurried scuffing, like someone shuffling through leaves and broken branches. My heartbeat accelerated, but I remembered the rules. I didn't turn my head. I didn't respond. The sound repeated, closer now, circling the clearing as if the forest itself were shifting it, testing my resolve. I forced myself to breathe steadily, focusing entirely on the path, on the subtle markers that indicated safety. Then I saw a flash of movement. A figure, almost invisible in the fog, darted between two massive oaks. It was dressed in a ranger's uniform, but the proportions were slightly off, limbs too long, torso elongated, head tilting unnaturally. My stomach churned. It mimicked my stance perfectly. crouching when I crouched, tilting its head when I glanced to the side. My pulse threatened to betray me, but I remained rigid, obeying the unspoken rules I had learned through trial and terror. Marlin's whisper broke the silence. Do not acknowledge it. Move slowly, deliberately, towards those who understand its patterns. I obeyed, keeping every motion precise and controlled. The figure remained in my peripheral vision, a silent mirror of my own actions. Occasionally, it seemed to glance toward Marlin, then back to me, always patient, always observing. I realized with a chill that the echoes weren't just residual, they were reactive. They adjusted, evolved, and replayed themselves based on my actions, constantly testing my awareness and discipline. The forest seemed to pulse around us. The rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the subtle shifting of shadows, all became part of the rhythm I had to follow. I noticed faint impressions in the soil that had not been there before. Footprints of varying sizes, some half-erased, some sharp and distinct, moving in patterns that defied natural walking paths. These were the marks of rangers who had come before, preserved in memory, replaying endlessly as part of the forest's lesson. A low whisper rose from the mist, layering over itself in complex harmonics. Names, rangers, hikers, voices that I recognized from brief encounters. Voices that sounded impossibly like my own. They drifted through the clearing, circling me, testing the limits of my focus. I forced my gaze forward, stepping carefully, counting my movements, memorizing the subtle cues of the path. Every misstep or glance toward the echoes could have consequences. We reached a narrow bridge of roots spanning a shallow chasm, the ground mist curling around it like slow-moving water. A figure appeared on the other side, motionless, half obscured by fog. It mirrored Marlin's stance perfectly, arms crossed, shoulders steady. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I realized that every echo we encountered served a purpose. Some were warnings, some were lessons, some were tests of self-control and observation. To survive here, I had to move through them without reacting, without engaging, and without hesitation. The Lost Trail had taught me rules. The echoes taught me awareness. The forest itself demanded something more, a mastery of observation, a discipline of mind, and a patience that bordered on obsession. Every whisper, shadow, and figure was a message, a fragment of memory, a challenge. Every choice I made was noted. Every glance was recorded. I understood then that the forest's memory was vast and patient. It preserved, reflected, and replayed the lives of those who had wandered too far. And if I failed to obey, if I allowed curiosity or fear to guide me, I could become just another echo, lingering in the mist for someone else to encounter. Another lesson in the forest's endless classroom. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing as the forest's presence intensified. The mist gathered in patches along the edges of the trail, curling around roots and stones like living fingers. Every sound, the creak of a branch, the subtle shuffle of leaves, the whisper of my own breath, was amplified, becoming part of the forest chorus. Shapes flickered at the corners of my vision, humanoid yet impossible, and each seemed to watch me, measure me, learn me. I paused on a slight rise to examine the trail ahead. The ground was marked with shallow depressions, impressions of shoes and boots that were not mine, not Marlin's, but perfectly formed and precise. They twisted and curved, sometimes disappearing into the fog, sometimes reappearing ahead or behind us. The forest had recorded the passage of others, imprinting their presence onto the path itself. I realized that every ranger who had failed, every lost hiker, every misstep, had become part of this living record. The echoes were everywhere, and they adapted, replaying themselves differently depending on how I moved, what I observed and what I ignored. A low murmur rose in the fog, layered and distorted, carrying fragments of voices I didn't fully recognize. Names were repeated, sometimes my own, sometimes those of rangers Marlin had mentioned. Voices folded into each other, creating an eerie harmony that was impossible to ignore. I focused on the markers, the notches in the bark, the patterns of moss along the roots, and the subtle alignment of rocks that indicated the safest path. Each step had to be precise. Each pause had to be calculated. Then I saw it, a figure crouched between two gnarled oaks, partially obscured by mist. It mimicked my posture perfectly, tilting its head as I tilted mine, moving slightly when I adjusted my pack. My stomach twisted, my pulse raced, but I forced myself to remain still and unreactive. I remembered Marlin's words. The forest observes patience and obedience above all else. Responding, reacting, or acknowledging the echoes could mark me as unworthy, as someone who would join the countless other impressions recorded here. As we moved past the figure, the forest seemed to shift subtly, branches bending, fog curling, creating new patterns in the light. Shadows lengthened unnaturally. Shapes flickered just beyond sight, and whispers continued, calling softly, repeating syllables, names, and fragments of conversation that I had never heard but somehow understood. The echoes were alive, reactive, patient, and infinitely persistent. We reached a fallen tree across the trail. Its bark was slick with moss, roots jutting into the path like fingers. More figures emerged from the mist, some standing, some crouched, all mimicking the movements of rangers long gone. I recognized the rhythm now, the way the forest replayed actions, adjusted to the observer, tested the endurance, and measured the discipline. It was teaching me, but it was also recording me, folding my presence into its memory for future lessons. Marlin gestured to the path beyond the fallen tree. "The forest preserves everything," he said quietly. "These echoes are not spirits in the usual sense. They are memories, remnants, lessons encoded into the trail. They adapt, they shift, they respond, and they will continue to test you every step of the way. Learn to move through them without reaction. Observation is your only shield." I nodded, forcing my muscles to relax while remaining alert. Each step became an exercise in precision, each breath measured, each glance intentional. The forest pressed in around me, alive in a way I could not have imagined. The lost trail had taught rules, but the echoes were the ultimate lesson. Awareness, patience, and respect for a memory-laden presence that never rested, never forgot, and never forgave recklessness. A clearing opened ahead, faintly illuminated by the fading light. The mist swirled, carrying whispers, shadows, and shapes that hinted at lives intertwined with the forest's memory. I could see the subtle depressions in the soil, piles of stones carefully arranged, twisted branches forming near human forms, all deliberate and instructive. The forest was not just teaching, it was recording, replaying, and judging. As we crossed the clearing, the echoes intensified. Names were called softly, voices layered, and figures flickered between visibility and disappearance. They mirrored our movements, creating a sense of being followed by countless observers, each a fragment of a person who had once wandered these paths and failed to respect the rules. The air was thick, almost electric, charged with the weight of accumulated memory. I understood then that survival here required more than adherence to written rules. It required mastery of observation, anticipation of the forest's tests, and the patience to endure without faltering. Every sound, every shadow, every whispered name was a challenge to remain vigilant and disciplined. The echoes were endless, reactive, patient, and precise, teaching lessons in ways that no human could fully anticipate. By the time we reached the edge of the clearing, the sun had dipped lower, casting the forest into half light. The mist clung stubbornly to the shadows, swirling around the remnants of the lost. I felt the weight of the forest presence more strongly than ever, aware that the echoes were not passive. They were active, waiting for the next mistake, the slightest lapse in awareness, the tiniest sign of distraction. And I knew that every step forward was a step deeper into the forest memory, where the echoes of the missing waited patiently for those who dared to test the boundaries. The day had grown long, and the forest seemed to shift subtly with the fading light. The lost trail and the echoes of the missing had left a weight on my mind, a quiet tension that pressed against every thought. My steps were slower, deliberate, each footfall measured, my eyes scanning for the faint trail markers Marlin had taught me to trust. I felt the forest observing, and I knew that every motion, every glance, every breath was recorded in the subtle memory of the trees, the moss, the fog, and the shadows. Marlin moved ahead silently, his presence steady, an anchor in the living, breathing entity that the forest had become. I followed, conscious of every slight deviation, every subtle curve in the roots, every small pile of stones placed carefully as markers, warnings, or perhaps lessons. The air had grown colder, heavier, and the whispers of the echoes lingered faintly in the background, wrapping around the trees and drifting along the trail as though the forest itself were breathing. I reached a small clearing by a quiet stream, the water barely moving, reflecting the distorted shapes of branches overhead. I crouched down to study the reflection, expecting only my own face staring back at me. But the water rippled, and the image shifted. My face remained, but behind it, faint shapes moved in the mist, shadows twisting, bending, almost human. The forest had taught me to observe without reaction, to read the subtle cues of its memory, and yet, looking into the reflection now, I felt an unsettling recognition. The echoes were not just around me, they were part of me, mirrored in ways I could not fully comprehend. Marlin stepped beside me quietly. "The forest tests not only obedience," he said softly, "but understanding. It mirrors what it observes, reflecting back lessons and truths. Sometimes it will show you what you fear, sometimes what you are, and sometimes what you could become if you stray from the path." I studied the water, the rippling reflection of trees, moss, and fog twisting around my image. Faint whispers layered over the soft trickle of the stream, voices I had heard before, repeating fragments of names, phrases, and sounds, now mingling with my own heartbeat. The echoes had followed me here, but they were different. They were interactive, layered with meaning, a reflection not only of lost lives, but also of my own presence in this living, observing forest. I straightened slowly, careful not to startle the subtle shapes in the mist. My reflection in the water shifted again, flickering, bending, showing brief glimpses of figures crouched behind trees, standing just beyond the clearing, always silent, always watching. I realized then that the forest did not simply preserve echoes of the missing. It used them as tools, mirrors of past, present, and perhaps even future, testing awareness and patience, demanding the kind of focus that bordered on obsession. Marlin gestured toward the path that led back to the cabin. "The final lesson is to recognize that the forest records everything. Every hesitation, every glance, every thought expressed in action or in attention. The reflections you see are part of that record. And surviving this place means understanding that your own actions are now part of the forest memory." We moved along the trail, the sun dipping lower, shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground. Each pile of stones, each twisted branch, each echoing sound carried a lesson, a reminder, a reflection of the countless rangers and hikers who had walked before and failed to honor the rules. I felt the forest pressing closer, its presence almost tangible, whispering silently through the trees, guiding, testing, observing. A sudden ripple of movement caught my eye, shapes emerging in the mist along the edges of the clearing. They were subtle at first, flickering, like glimpses through a distorted mirror. I recognized the forms, echoes of rangers I had only heard of, moments captured and replayed endlessly. Some mirrored my stance exactly, crouched when I crouched, arms shifting when I adjusted my pack, heads tilting with my glance. The forest memory was alive, reactive, and patient, and I realized that every decision I made here was feeding that memory. Marlin paused, his gaze fixed on the figures that flickered in the mist. "Do not engage them," he said quietly. "They are lessons, not companions. The forest will reward observation and patience. Curiosity or fear can bind you here, adding you to the echoes. Remember that the reflection is not just in the water or the shadows, it is in the choices you make. Everything is recorded, folded into the forest memory." I nodded, feeling the full weight of his words. The forest was no longer just trails and fog. It was a living, sentient record, absorbing the movements, choices, and attentions of those who entered. Every echo of the missing, every whisper, every shadow was a layer in this immense, patient archive. And I was now a part of it, walking carefully, consciously, fully aware that my presence here mattered in ways I could barely comprehend. As we continued along the final stretch of the trail, the whispers and reflections faded slightly, retreating into the mist, but never fully gone. The forest had taught me the rules, revealed the lost trail, and introduced me to the echoes. Now it demanded something more, a deep understanding of observation, endurance, and respect. Every shadow, every reflection, every whispered name was a reminder that survival was not merely physical, it was mental, spiritual, and intricately tied to the patient, watchful memory of the forest itself. The trail narrowed as we approached a dense thicket, roots twisting across the path like gnarled fingers. I moved slowly, deliberately, measuring each step against the subtle cues Marlin had taught me to observe. Shadows clung to the edges of vision, shifting, stretching, as though alive, reflecting my movements in unsettling precision. The whispers from the mist had grown faint, yet the memory of their presence weighed heavily on me, a constant reminder that the forest never truly let go of anyone. Marlin's presence was steady beside me, a silent guide through the living archive. "The echoes are not passive," he said softly. "They adapt. They will shift depending on how you act, how you perceive them, and even how you think. The forest mirrors more than motion. It mirrors intent. It can sense hesitation, fear, or curiosity, and it responds accordingly." I realized he was right. As I moved through the thicket, figures appeared, crouched low, mirroring subtle movements of my arms and shoulders. When I adjusted my pack strap, a shadow shifted identically. The forest memory was reactive, precise, and infinitely patient. It did not tire, it did not forget, and it did not forgive lapses in attention. A patch of fog rose ahead, denser than before, curling around the trees and pooling in the shallow depressions of the forest floor. Within it, faint impressions of past travelers were visible, footsteps, handprints on bark, subtle depressions where someone had paused, rested, or fallen. The echoes were layered, some faint and barely discernible, others sharp, as if etched into reality itself. I felt the weight of countless presences around me, all of them recorded by this patient, sentient forest. Marlin gestured toward a small clearing just beyond the fog. "The range's reflection," he said, "is both a literal and metaphorical lesson. Observe yourself in the context of the forest memory. See how your actions are mirrored, recorded, and interpreted. Only by understanding your own reflection in this way can you move safely, and only then can you carry this knowledge beyond the forest. I approached the clearing cautiously. A shallow pond reflected the fading light of the sun, though the image it displayed was more than just my own. Figures moved in the water, ghostly and indistinct, but unmistakably mirroring past mistakes, movements, and hesitations of rangers and hikers who had walked these paths before me. Their reflections were imperfect, yet hauntingly precise, teaching, warning, and testing all at once. I knelt at the edge, studying the surface. My own reflection stared back, but the surrounding echoes shifted subtly with every small movement I made. Head turning, posture adjusting, as if the forest itself were holding a mirror to my every decision. The lesson was clear. Surviving the lost trail was not about brute caution alone. It required understanding the forest's memory, anticipating its reactions, and moving with deliberate intention, fully aware that every micro-action could have consequences. A whisper drifted across the pond, soft, layered, indistinct, repeating fragments of names I had heard before. Some were real, some echoes, some distorted fragments of my own voice. The water rippled in patterns that corresponded with the murmured names, creating a subtle choreography of memory and reflection. I felt the pull of curiosity, but resisted. Observation, patience, and awareness had to guide my actions. Any lapse could add my presence to the growing archive of the lost trail. Marlin's voice broke the silence again, quiet but firm. The forest shows you what you are capable of, but it also records what you fail to control. The echoes are lessons. The reflections are reminders. Together, they teach endurance, discipline, and understanding. You are learning not just to survive, but to exist in harmony with a memory that never forgets and never tires. I straightened, taking careful steps along the pond's edge. The echoes shifted, fading slightly, retreating into the mist, yet their presence remained. A silent, patient force reminding me that the forest was alive in ways far beyond ordinary comprehension. Every shadow, every ripple, every whisper was a reflection not only of those who had come before, but of myself, folded into the forest's memory. The clearing opened fully as we moved forward, the fading sunlight casting long, distorted shadows across the water. The pond's surface shimmered with layers of reflection, mirroring not only the past and present, but the possibilities of what might happen if one strayed from the path. I realized then that the forest demanded total respect, unwavering attention, and an understanding that survival here was not merely about walking safely. It was about integrating oneself into the careful, patient, and watchful memory that defined every inch of this unmarked wilderness. We left the pond behind, but the weight of its lessons remained heavy on my shoulders. Every step along the narrowing trail felt charged, alive, as if the forest itself were assessing my ability to carry forward what I had learned. The echoes of the missing lingered faintly in the mist, subtle reminders of the consequences of inattention or curiosity, whispering names and gestures that were no longer present but still recorded in the memory of the trees. The canopy thickened overhead, filtering the last light of the day into fractured, green-gold patterns that danced across the forest floor. Shadows shifted unnaturally, elongating and folding upon themselves, yet I had grown accustomed to observing without reacting. The lost trail and the echoes had taught me to anticipate, to measure, and to move deliberately. Every heartbeat, every breath, every glance was purposeful, harmonized with the rhythm of the forest itself. Marlin's voice broke the silence, steady and low. "This is the final lesson," he said. "The ranger's reflection is more than mirrors or echoes. It is understanding your place in the forest memory. Everything here, every sound, every movement, every misstep is recorded. Your survival depends not only on awareness, but on respect for the presence around you. The forest teaches patience, observation, and endurance, but it is unforgiving to those who fail to internalize its lessons. I pressed forward, stepping over roots and carefully around patches of moss that marked the forest's subtle signs. Figures appeared in the fog at the edges of my vision, crouched or standing, mirroring past actions of myself and others who had walked this trail before me. The forest memory was comprehensive and reactive. It adapted based on observation, on hesitation, on attention. It was patient, endless, and meticulous, a living archive of every traveler who had dared to walk here. Reaching a small ridge, I paused and looked back along the trail. The fog swirled, and in its movement, I glimpsed faint outlines of figures, rangers and hikers, some I had read about in records, some unknown, all captured as echoes in the forest's memory. Their presence was quiet but intense, a reminder that every lapse, every curiosity, and every fear was carefully preserved. The forest did not forget. It did not tire, and it did not forgive mistakes. I knelt again beside a cluster of stones arranged deliberately by hands long gone. They formed a subtle pattern, a map of attention and caution, a lesson left for those willing to observe. My reflection in a small puddle nearby shimmered, overlaid with faint images of figures crouched or standing behind trees, each an echo, each a test. I understood finally that the ranger's reflection was not just about seeing oneself, but about recognizing how one's actions were intertwined with the forest's living memory. Marlin's words resonated deeply. The forest preserves every choice, every hesitation, every act of awareness. The echoes are not only of the missing, they are a mirror of your presence. Every step you take, every shadow you ignore, every whisper you resist becomes part of the archive. The forest is patient, and it observes all. As dusk fell fully, the forest shifted again. Mist curled along the trail like slow-moving specters. Shadows lengthened, and whispers rose faintly, carrying names and fragments of sound from those who had been here long before. I moved carefully, deliberately, each step measured against the patterns I had learned to read. Alignment of stones, moss growth, tree notches, and the subtle bends of roots across the path. The echoes followed, reactive yet fading slightly as I passed, reflecting both the forest memory and my own disciplined obedience. The final stretch of the trail opened into a wide clearing. Ancient trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches interwoven above, and the forest seemed to exhale in the dimming light. Shapes lingered in the mist, watching, mirroring. But I understood now that my observation without reaction was the key. I had walked the lost trail, endured the echoes, and respected the forest's lessons. My reflection was no longer only in the water or shadows. It was in my careful, deliberate presence, harmonized with the forest's memory. Marlin turned to me finally, his eyes steady. You have learned what few survive to understand. The forest records everything, and now your presence is part of its living memory. Respect it, observe it, and carry its lessons wherever you go. This is the ranger's reflection. Patience, awareness, and harmony with what the forest remembers. Never forget that this place is patient, meticulous, and enduring. You are part of it now, and it is part of you. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of understanding settle over me. The whispers faded, the shadows softened, and the echoes of the missing receded into the mist, leaving behind the quiet stillness of the forest. I realized that being a ranger in this unmarked park was more than guiding travelers or protecting nature. It was a covenant with a living, sentient memory that tested every action, every thought, and every step. As the last light of day disappeared behind the dense canopy, I felt a strange sense of peace. The forest had tested me, reflected me, and preserved me as part of its patient archive. I had walked through the lost trail, observed the echoes of the missing, and understood the ranger's reflection. And as night fell fully, I knew that while the forest never forgot, I now carried its lessons with me, a living awareness of the quiet, patient, and enduring presence that existed beyond maps, beyond records, and beyond ordinary comprehension. The forest held its breath, and I walked forward, careful, aware, and forever changed, knowing that the memories of the missing, the whispers in the mist, and the reflections in the shadows would continue to guide and test all who dared to walk these hidden paths.